Josh Kelly versus David Avanesyan, the fight that seemed doomed to never happen, is finally here. Well, on Saturday, and you never know in this crazy world what could happen between now and then to prevent it from taking place, but let's just assume that it will, and let's hope that the wait was worth it. Now, I've seen a lot of British boxing fans express skepticism when it comes to Josh Kelly. People weren't impressed by his recent performances, and they were impressed by Avanesyan's recent performances. So I'm seeing a lot of people picking Avanesyan to win, and many of them picking him to win by knockout. I've watched several of Avanesyan's fights. I saw the second fight against Lahara. I'm not sure if I saw the first fight. I definitely saw the second fight. That was a first round KO. I also saw his last fight. If we check it here, forget the guy's name. I saw his last fight against Jose Del Rio, also a first round KO. And I saw his fight against Lamont Peterson. I actually did a post-fight review for that one there. That was back in 2017. And okay, Avanesyan has fought at a higher level than Josh Kelly, no doubt about it. But I'm not as impressed with Avanesyan as a lot of other people seem to be. People calling him a beast and all this kind of stuff. I don't know. He didn't really impress me against Lamont Peterson. And people are talking about Avanesyan's power. Lamont Peterson has never had an iron jaw. Remember, Amir Khan put him on the floor. He was knocked out early by Lucas Matisse. And that was at a lighter weight. I believe that was at 140. But judging by what I saw in the Peterson fight, he doesn't have Matisse level power, does he? So, I don't know. I wouldn't go as far as calling him a beast at all, Avanesyan. He's a good fighter, as I say, fought at a higher level than Josh Kelly, but he's also a fairly small guy. If you see them face to face, not only is Josh Kelly taller, but his frame just looks bigger. His head looks bigger than Avanesyan. Now, again, this doesn't mean he's going to win the fight, but I'm just taking that into account, the fact that he's, from what I can see, a naturally bigger human being. And in addition to being a naturally bigger human being, he's also faster, he's more athletically gifted. Although his athleticism hasn't really allowed him to impress the way people would have wanted it to have done, right? Because against Ray Robinson, that was a draw, and many people feel like he was fortunate to even get a draw. Winston Campos, he did win that wide on the cards, but he was cut in the first round in that fight. And again, people are looking at that thinking they gave you a soft touch and you're getting cut in the first round and touched up with jabs and stuff like that. Prior to that, he fought this guy here, I believe he was Polish. Again, a lot of people weren't particularly impressed by this performance. Whereas I look at it like, yes, Josh Kelly failed to impress in those fights to a large degree. I think Josh Kelly is a bit too much in love with his own athleticism. He goes out there wanting to show off and show everybody how quick his hands are, show everybody how quick his feet are and all this kind of stuff. And he probably hasn't developed his boxing IQ to the level of his athleticism. And maybe he never will, but I'm sure his boxing IQ is going to get better than it is now. But against Avanesyan, because there are so many British people picking Josh Kelly to lose, that might be exactly what Josh Kelly needs. Because if he goes in there and boxes, let's say, a safety first fight and wins the majority, vast majority of the rounds and comes out with a legitimate, let's say, 118, 110 scorecard, not a Eddie Hearn special, but a legitimate one, a landslide victory. A lot of people are going to turn around and say, okay, Josh Kelly was quite impressive there because, they thought he was going to lose. They thought he was going to get knocked out, but he ended up totally schooling the guy. Like Conor Benn, and I'll come on to Conor Benn in just a second, but Conor Benn in recent fights has been schooling people. If Josh Kelly does something like that and goes the distance and schools the guy, that's going to all of a sudden look tremendously impressive because of the perception that so many people have that Josh Kelly is not very good and he's going to get beaten up here. So if, for example, it was the opposite situation where people were expecting Josh Kelly to destroy Avanesyan, if he then went in there and outboxed him over 12 rounds, people wouldn't be so impressed. You get what I'm saying? So the perception of the public can actually help or hinder the fighter, depending on the situation they're in. In this particular situation, there's an opportunity here for Josh Kelly to get away with a boring performance, but still win the respect of the public in doing so. You see? You've had Avanesyan come out saying Josh Kelly's going to run and this, that, and the other. He mustn't take that bait. If he plans to stick and move and use his height and reach, then that's what he should do. Don't get drawn into Avanesyan's game. Stick to a disciplined game plan. Don't be, anxious to show everybody your hand speed and throw 7 left hooks in a row. Don't worry about that. At the end of the day, Josh Kelly is very inexperienced compared to Avanesyan. He's not the kind of guy, Avanesyan, that you want to be experimenting against, that you want to be freestyling against too much if you're Josh Kelly. You want to be boxing a disciplined fight, keeping your distance, not trying to engage him. Because again, Josh Kelly, even though he has athleticism and all that, his boxing IQ in terms of you throw this shot, I throw that shot. I feint with this one, you go for the feint, I hit you with this particular counter. He's not advanced at doing that kind of stuff yet. I remember watching him in the amateurs and he got his head boxed off by some guy. I think he was he a North African guy or something, but he absolutely got his head boxed off. So he has this tremendous athleticism, but his boxing IQ isn't there yet. It's like Amir Khan, right? Amir Khan early on in his career was just all hand speed. He was desperate to show everybody how quick his hand speed was, so he would show the hand speed early on in fights. Whereas as he got older and matured as a fighter, he had performances like we saw against Devon Alexander, which was one of his best performances. And he didn't really throw, 20 punch combinations in that fight. It was a very disciplined, controlled performance. Even when he fought Collazo, similar situation there, disciplined and controlled. He only let his hands go when it was appropriate to do so. He only started, flashing real multi-punch combinations when it was the right time to do so. And that's what Josh Kelly has to learn as well. He needs to rein in the flashiness a little bit, particularly for this fight. Because if he doesn't, then he could end up the way a lot of British boxing fans are predicting, which is flat on his back. Or just getting beaten up and losing the fight. So I personally think, based upon what I've seen of both fighters over the years, Josh Kelly does have the beating of Avanesyan if he boxes the right kind of fight, if he keeps disciplined. And that might not be easy for a guy like him because he's clearly somebody who likes to be flashy. Both guys have been out the ring for a while, right? Josh Kelly hasn't fought since December 2019. Avanesyan hasn't fought since also December 2019. So they've been out the ring for the exact same amount of time. But interestingly, and maybe crucially, Avanesyan's last 2 fights were first round knockouts. So he hasn't had a fight that went any rounds until since nearly 2 years ago now. Whereas with Josh Kelly, it wasn't quite as long, a bit over a year. So, and also with Josh Kelly, his most recent fights, in fact, his last 3 fights all went 10 rounds. So he's been going the distance. He's been getting the rounds in. And we also can deduce from that Josh Kelly won't have any issue going 12 against Avanesyan because of the fact that, look, he's been 10 rounds back-to-back 3 times. That may stand him in good stead. That should stand him in good stead. Because it's a psychological thing. It's not just a physical thing. It's psychological. With a young fighter like Josh Kelly, it doesn't matter how good a shape he's in, how athletic he is, how many rounds he does sparring in the gym. Until you've done the distance in the ring, in an actual pro fight, there's often going to be doubts in the back of your mind. Can you pace yourself over the full course? You know, if it's a rough fight, if it's a difficult fight, and he had a difficult fight against Ray Robinson, and he managed to go the distance, and it was a majority draw. So I think that will stand him in good stead. Hopefully Adam Booth can rein him in a bit, get him to fight more disciplined, and just, I really think that the fact Avanesyan is a short guy with a noticeably shorter reach than Josh Kelly, that should be to Kelly's advantage. Because if he was fighting a guy who had all Avanesyan's attributes but was just taller and matched Josh Kelly for reach, it would be a much more difficult proposition. But the fact he's in there against a much shorter guy, Avanesyan's at least 2 inches shorter. And when you're talking about welterweights, 2 inches is a lot more than if you're talking about heavyweights. One guy's 6'6", the other guy's 6'8". Proportionate to their height, it's not that much difference, 2 inches. But when you're talking about much shorter guys, 2 inches proportionate to their overall height is more, right? But like when Deontay Wilder beat Berman Stavern has got better hand skills than Deontay Wilder. If you actually look at Stavern when he fought Chris Arreola, his ability to catch and shoot, his ability to counterpunch, his punch variety, his overall punch quality for Berman Stavern is better than Wilder. But Wilder was able to nullify all that just by taking advantage of his height and reach, by not allowing Stavern to get close enough whereby he could start using his superior hand skills. You see, Josh Kelly, I think, obviously, Avanesyan, more athletic than someone like Berman Stavern. It's not always like for like comparing a welterweight fight to a heavyweight fight. I get that. But the same principle, I think, would apply here, where Josh Kelly just has to make it a big tall man fight. Keep Avanesyan on the outside, move away. Yeah, you might want to mix some meaty shots in here and there, but just keep him at bay. Now, some people are talking about Josh Kelly's punching power, and I've talked about it in the past. They say it doesn't really hit that hard, or he doesn't hit hard enough to fight in the style that he fights in, because a lot of people were comparing him to Prince Nassim. Prince Nassim, of course, was a tremendous puncher, whereas Josh Kelly, pound for pound, doesn't appear to have that kind of oomph behind his shots. Nonetheless, I don't think Josh Kelly is a powder puff puncher. I just think that he doesn't really set the shots up in a way which is conducive to producing knockouts. See, I use these different terms. I describe somebody as being a prolific puncher, and then I say being a hard puncher isn't always the same thing, because there are people who hit very hard, but they don't have the knack for landing those hard shots on the target during the course of action on a consistent basis. And therefore, a lot of those guys don't have high knockout ratios. But then you've got other guys who don't really have massive one-punch power, but they're able to land so consistently and so accurately that they get stoppages off accumulation, and they have high knockout ratios. A good example of that I've used many times before is comparing Vitaly Klitschko to Vladimir Klitschko, because all the common opponents said that Vladimir Klitschko hit much harder, but yet Vitaly Klitschko, at least for much of their careers, had a higher knockout percentage. So, how hard a fighter hits isn't always accurately reflected by the knockout percentage. Josh Kelly, I'm not saying he's, Randall Bailey. I'm not saying he hits as hard as the top welterweights, but I feel like as his ring IQ develops and he settles down a bit, he'll probably start getting more knockouts, more clean knockouts and stuff like that. If he can just settle down a bit and be more patient. Most trainers will tell you that when you go looking for the knockout, and Kelly is a guy who looks like he's always after the knockout. When you go looking for the knockout, it eludes you. But when you just box, when you stay calm and, don't go looking for it, that's when the opportunities tend to present themselves, and you almost go into autopilot, where the stuff you've been practicing and training starts working for you. It's like you don't even have to think. As soon as you see the opportunity, bam, you've done the drill so many times, your arm comes out automatically and you're hitting the guy on the chin. And situations like that, opportunities like that arise when you stop looking for the knockout. Just let the knockout come to you. It will happen. Or it will happen more often. And again, these are the things I would suggest that Josh Kelly needs to learn to do. Just relax a bit in the ring and stop trying to force everything. You know, he is a very athletically gifted guy, and I guess he feels like he can overwhelm people with that athleticism. But he's no Roy Jones Jr. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Josh Kelly against Avanesyan. I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of British fans, maybe it's just the hardcores who are doing this, but there's certainly a large percentage of the British fans who are picking Avanesyan to win, and for good reason. I'm not at all dissing them for doing that or saying that they shouldn't be picking Avanesyan. Maybe they'll be right. Conor Benn is one of the people who is leaning towards Avanesyan. He thinks it's too early in Josh Kelly's career. Conor Benn, of course, has been calling Josh Kelly out for years. I thought that it was ridiculous to even contemplate the idea of Conor Benn fighting Josh Kelly. I thought Josh Kelly was much too big and strong and talented for him. But the gap, if there is one between them, is a lot narrower now than it was several years ago when Conor Benn was going life and death with people like Payno, right? Conor Benn in his past few performances has looked very impressive. So him versus Josh Kelly doesn't seem so ridiculous to people like me now. And of course, Conor Benn has won some fights recently in landslide victories on the cards. So going back to what I said earlier, because Conor Benn wasn't expected to win comfortably on points, he was expected to have a real torrid time against his most recent opponent. He went in there and he schooled him. Came out with a UD. People said he did a better job than Sean Porter. If that was a guy that people expected him to blow away in one round, they wouldn't have been so impressed. You see it. And that's the situation here for Josh Kelly. If he goes out there and just schools Avanesyan, stays away, sticks a jab on him, uses his superior foot speed and athleticism, and comes out with a wide UD, a legitimate one, then he's everybody's hero again. So let's see what happens. Drop your comments below and let me know what you think is going to happen. I'm out. If you'd like to access all my boxing content advert-free and enjoy the convenience of listening via a podcast app with the option to download in high-quality MP3, then consider joining me on Patreon. In addition to the aforementioned perks, you'll also gain access to exclusive weekly live stream Q&A sessions and hangouts, as well as uncensored, no-holds-barred uploads, which are too blue for YouTube. This includes my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. We've also got a Discord server where you can come and chat and hang out with myself and other members. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Boxing Extra. There's no contract, there's no commitment. It's only £2.50 a month and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of hardcore boxing enthusiasts by signing up with me here on Patreon today.